The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and by Thursday afternoon, Hester Keating was on a westbound train with one trunk, a sewing kit, and a heart full of things she had never said aloud. She was 24 years old, the kind of woman who kept her feelings pressed flat like flowers between the pages of a book, and she had agreed to make the journey not because she particularly wanted to leave Philadelphia, but because her mother had asked her with eyes that would not take no for an answer. Aunt Clara was dying. Aunt Clara was alone out in New Mexico territory, a woman who had followed a dream and a husband westward 2 decades prior and had outlived both of them, and now she was fading in a small adobe house on the edge of a town called Myra Wells, and she had written to ask if someone might come. The family had deliberated for exactly 2 evenings before all eyes settled on Hester. She had no husband. She had no particular occupation beyond helping her mother run the household and doing fine embroidery work for a seamstress on the main street. She had, the family agreed, the fewest reasons to stay. Hester had not argued. She had packed her trunk quietly and kissed her mother on the cheek and boarded the Pennsylvania Railroad line heading southwest. And now she sat in the second-class car watching Ohio roll past her window and wondering how a woman arrived at 24 with so little she could point to and say, "That is mine." The journey took 4 days. She changed lines twice, once in St. Louis and once in Albuquerque, and by the time the final smaller rail line deposited her at the Myra Wells station, the afternoon sun was so ferocious that the air above the platform seemed to ripple and breathe. The station was a small wooden building with a hand-painted sign above the door, and a few horses were tied to the post out front, flicking their tails at the dust. Hester stepped down from the train car carrying her small traveling bag and squinting into the light, and she stood there for a moment feeling more foreign than she had ever felt in her life. And then she saw him. He was leaning against the station post with his hat tipped down against the sun, a tall man in worn denim and a faded brown vest, his boots dusty as everything else in this landscape. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he was looking at the arriving passengers with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who had nowhere pressing to be. And when his eyes found hers through the crowd, something happened in his face. Not a dramatic thing, not something a stranger would have noticed. But she noticed, because she had spent 5 years telling herself she would never see Vernon Ellsworth again, and here he was. He straightened up from the post. He pulled his hat off. And then he smiled, slow and warm, and with that same particular quality it had always had. The kind of smile that made a person feel they had just stepped out of the cold into somewhere bright. "Hester Keating," he said. She stood very still for a moment, her traveling bag hanging from her hand, the train steaming at her back and the whole blazing territory stretching around them. Then she said, "Vernon." That was all, just the one word. But it carried everything the last 5 years had cost her to swallow down, and from the way his expression shifted just slightly, she thought perhaps he heard it. He had grown into himself since Philadelphia. He had been 20 when she last saw him, the son of a family friend who had shown up at 3 different garden parties in the summer of 1877, and had looked at her across the punch bowl like she was the only person in the room, and she had been foolish enough to look back. Nothing had come of it. His family had moved west that autumn, following economic opportunity, following land, following some dream that only made sense in a man's head and sounded like abandonment to the people left behind. He had said goodbye to her on the front steps of her parents' house on a September evening, and she had shaken his hand like a proper young woman and smiled like everything was perfectly fine. And then she had gone inside and cried into her pillow until her sister knocked on her door to ask what on earth was wrong. She had told her sister nothing. She had told everyone nothing. And then 5 years passed, and she had become a woman who pressed flowers and kept her feelings flat, and she had arrived on a dusty platform in New Mexico territory, and the first face she saw belonged to Vernon Ellsworth. He stepped forward and picked up her trunk from where the porter had set it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Your aunt wrote to me," he said. "Asked me to collect you from the station, said you might not know the way to the house." Hester found her voice. "You know my Aunt Clara. My family has the ranch about 3 miles east of Myra Wells. Your aunt and my mother were friendly for years. When my mother passed 2 winters ago, Miss Clara was kind about it." He paused. "I was sorry to hear she is not well." "Thank you," Hester said. She was watching his face and trying to remember how to be a person who did not care too much. "I did not know you were here." "We moved out to the territory in '77, he said. "My father and I, the land was good. We stayed." He set her trunk in the back of a wagon that was waiting at the edge of the platform, a sturdy bay horse standing patiently in the traces. "My father passed last year. It is just me and the hands now." She heard the weight of that, and she wanted to say something that was worthy of it, but she was still adjusting to the extraordinary strangeness of finding him here in all this sun and dust, as if the universe had simply decided that 5 years of careful forgetting was enough. "I am sorry about your father," she said, "and your mother. Thank you." He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a courtesy that was entirely natural, his hand steady under her arm. Then he climbed up beside her and took the reins, and the horse started forward, and Myra Wells spread out before them. It was a small town, perhaps 100 buildings, a wide main street of packed dirt with a general store and a saloon and a hotel and a church at the far end with a white-painted steeple. Everything had a sun-bleached, provisional quality, as if it was still deciding whether to become permanent. "Is it very different from Philadelphia?" he asked, and his voice had just the faintest note of amusement in it. "It is very different from anywhere I have ever been," she said honestly. He nodded. "It grows on you." She did not say that it already was, in that relentless afternoon light and that smell of sage and hot earth and something clean she had no name for. She looked instead at the road ahead, and at the way the distant mountains stood blue and enormous against the sky, and she thought about Aunt Clara waiting at the end of this road, and she concentrated very hard on being practical. Aunt Clara's house was a low adobe structure set back from a narrow road, shaded on one side by a large cottonwood tree that rustled with a sound like dry water. There was a small garden at the front, somewhat overgrown, and a covered porch where a woman sat in a rocking chair wrapped in a shawl despite the heat. She was thin in the way of people whose illness has been taking from them steadily, her face more angles than it used to be, but her eyes were bright and sharp and entirely Clara when Hester climbed down from the wagon and walked toward her. "Hester," she said, and her voice was thinner too, but warm. "You came." "Of course I came," Hester said, and she bent down and embraced her aunt carefully, feeling how fragile she had become, and something tightened in her chest. Clara looked past her to where Vernon was lifting her trunk from the wagon. "Vernon, thank you for collecting her." "Happy to do it, Miss Clara." He tipped his hat. "Come inside for water before you head back," she said in a tone that was not quite a request. They sat in Clara's small kitchen, which smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and Clara poured water from a clay pitcher and watched the two of them with an expression that Hester could not entirely read. She was an old woman who had spent decades in the territory and had acquired the habit of directness that seemed to come with Western living. "You knew each other," Clara said. "It was not a question." "In Philadelphia," Hester said. "Some years ago. His mother told me," Clara said simply. She mentioned her son had been quite taken with a young woman at some parties, a Keating girl. She smiled at Vernon. "I did not put it together until your mother described her." Vernon set his water glass down. He was not looking at Hester, but there was something careful in the line of his jaw. "That was a while back," he said. 5 years, Clara said placidly. "Not so very long." She looked at Hester. "He has built a fine ranch. You should see it sometime." "Aunt Clara," Hester said gently. "I am dying, Hester, not senile," her aunt said with perfect serenity. "I intend to say whatever seems useful to me." Vernon glanced at Hester then, just briefly, and there was something in the look that might have been shared humor, and it undid about 3 of the careful layers she had built around herself in 5 years. She looked back at her water glass. He left after another quarter hour, promising to check back in a few days to see if anything was needed. Hester watched his wagon move down the road from the porch, and when she came back inside, her aunt was watching her from the rocking chair that she had moved indoors for the evening. "Do not overthink it," Clara said. "I have no idea what you mean," Hester said. "Yes, you do," said Clara. That night Hester lay on the narrow cot in Clara's spare room and listened to the sounds of the territory at night, which were nothing like the sounds of Philadelphia. There were insects she had no names for, and a distant sound that might have been a coyote, and the deep, dry silence underneath everything. And she thought about Vernon Ellsworth's face when he saw her at the station, that slow, careful smile. And she pressed her hands flat on her stomach and breathed slowly and told herself to sleep. She did not sleep for a long time. She spent her first days in Myra Wells getting to know the rhythms of her aunt's life and her aunt's illness. Clara had a condition of the lungs that the doctor in town, a quiet man named Dr. Paulson who came on Thursdays, described with careful neutrality as progressive. There were medicines, tinctures and powders from the pharmacy, and there was rest, and there was not a great deal more to be done. Clara accepted this with a tranquility that Hester found both admirable and heartbreaking. She cooked simple meals and kept the house clean and sat with her aunt in the evenings while Clara talked, which she did freely and with evident pleasure, about her life. She had come west in 1861 with her husband Thomas, who had believed in free land and open skies and had died in 1875 of a fever, and she had stayed because by then this was her life and she had made her peace with it. She spoke about the territory without romanticizing it, talked about the hard winters and the droughts and the occasional violence of men who felt the law was a suggestion, but she also spoke about the sky at sunset and the way the mountains looked after rain and the neighbors who had been genuinely kind, and Vernon Ellsworth's family had been among them. "His father was a decent man," Clara said one evening, the lamp burning low between them. "Hard, determined. The kind of man who does not bend easily but does not break either. Vernon is more his mother's son, I think. She had a softness about her, felt things deeply." Hester kept her hands moving on the embroidery she had taken up. "You knew him when he was younger, since he was 20. He arrived with his parents looking like he was carrying something heavy, and gradually he set it down and became himself. By 25 he was running the ranch alongside his father. By 27 he was running it alone." Clara coughed, a sound that was becoming familiar and that Hester was learning not to flinch at. "He has not married." "Aunt Clara," Hester said. "I am making conversation," Clara said mildly. It was 4 days after her arrival that Vernon came back to the house, as he had promised. He came in the late afternoon with a basket that contained a wrapped portion of smoked beef from his ranch's stores and a jar of preserves that one of the women in town had sent. He was dressed in clean clothes, she noticed, which might have meant nothing, and he had combed his hair. They sat on the porch while Clara rested inside, because the afternoon heat had broken to something almost pleasant, and Hester poured lemonade from a pitcher she had made earlier, and for a while they said very little. Then he said without preamble, "How long are you planning to stay?" She looked at the cottonwood tree, at the way its leaves moved. "As long as she needs me." And after, she was quiet for a moment. "I have not thought past that. Philadelphia is a long way." "Yes," she agreed. He turned his hat in his hands. He had taken it off when he came to the porch, an unconscious courtesy. "I thought about writing to you," he said. "When we first came out here, your family's address was the same." Her heart did something that she ignored. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her directly. He had hazel eyes, a mix of brown and green that the afternoon light was making warm. "I did not think it was welcome," he said simply. She held very still. A proper young woman of her upbringing would have nodded and let that pass and kept the surface smooth. She had been a proper young woman for 5 years and it had not made her particularly happy. "That was not accurate," she said carefully. He went very still. Then he said, "No." "No," she said. The words sat between them in the warm air. He was looking at her with an expression that was very focused and very quiet. Then he said, "Good to know," and he sounded as if he meant something large by it. She felt her ears go warm, and she looked back at the cottonwood tree and thought that perhaps there was something to be said for the directness of the West after all. He came back 2 days later without any particular excuse, and they walked to the edge of the property and back in the late afternoon, while Clara sat on the porch and watched them with an expression of deep personal satisfaction. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the land and the particular quality of the soil and what it could grow. He was not a man who embellished, she discovered, or who made things larger than they were. He spoke about the territory plainly, its beauties and its difficulties with equal weight, and she liked that about him. She had grown up among people who performed their lives, who put a fine face on things and kept the suffering tidy, and Vernon's plainness felt like relief. She told him about Philadelphia, about the embroidery work in her mother's household and the garden parties that had begun to feel like circles she was walking in without going anywhere. She said it with more honesty than she had intended because something about the way he listened made her say more. "You were not happy," he said, not accusatory, just observing. "I was comfortable," she said. "I am not sure those are the same." "No," he agreed, "they are not." They stopped at the fence line where her aunt's small property met the road. The mountains were turning purple in the fading light, and a hawk was tracing a slow circle overhead, and Hester thought she had not breathed this cleanly in years. "This territory gets into you," he said, "if you let it." "I am beginning to understand that," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "You sound almost like you might stay." She laughed, and it surprised her how easy and real it came. "I have been here less than a week." "A week is enough for some people," he said, and then he smiled again in that unhurried way, and she thought that it had been enough for her. She just was not ready to say so out loud yet. Dr. Paulson came on his Thursday visit and sat with Clara for a long time while Hester made tea and waited in the kitchen. When he came out, he found her standing by the window and told her gently but without softening it that her aunt had perhaps 3 months, perhaps a little more, depending on how the lungs progressed. She thanked him. She stood at the window after he was gone and let herself feel the reality of it, which was the thing she had been keeping at arm's length since the platform. Clara had been the most interesting woman in her family, the one who had done the unexpected thing, who had gone west when women went to parlors, who had built a life with her own hands in a place that did not forgive weakness. And she was going to die in this small house, and Hester was going to watch it happen. She put her hand flat on the window glass and breathed. Then she put the tea on the stove and went to sit with her aunt. "I know what he told you," Clara said without opening her eyes. "He told me you need rest and good food and fresh air," Hester said. "He told you I am dying, which I already knew." Clara opened her eyes and looked at her. "I am not afraid of it, Hester. I want you to understand that. I have had a full life. Not an easy one, but a real one. That seems like enough." Hester's throat was tight. "It does not seem like enough from where I am sitting," Clara smiled. "That is because you are young and still in the middle of yours." She reached over and pressed Hester's hand. "That is why I wanted someone to come, not so someone could watch me go, but so I could see that someone was going somewhere." Hester did not entirely understand this yet. She was beginning to. The following Sunday, Vernon arrived in a clean shirt and his best boots and asked, with a formality that was somehow charming rather than stiff, if she would like to ride out and see some of the country. He had a spare horse, a quiet dun mare named Biscuit who had a disposition suited to riders who were not particularly accustomed to horses, and who he said had never thrown anyone in 7 years of riding. Hester had ridden in Philadelphia, well enough to sit a horse properly, but she had never ridden across open country like this, across the broad, flat scrubland with the mountains ahead, and the sky so enormous it felt like being inside something rather than under it. She wore the most practical dress she had brought, which was still not particularly practical, and she gripped the reins and let Biscuit carry her, and tried not to look too astonished by everything. Vernon rode beside her on a big gray horse named Colonel, who moved with the easy authority of an animal that had been ridden hard for years and trusted his rider completely. He took her up into the lower foothills, where the scrub gave way to juniper and pinon pine and the air changed, becoming cooler and faintly sharp. He showed her the river that ran down from the mountains, still running well in the spring, cutting between red rock banks. He showed her the remains of an old adobe structure that had been someone's home once, empty now and slowly returning to the earth it was made from. Who lived there, she asked. A ranching family named Garrett came out in the 60s, got pushed out by drought in the early 70s. He looked at the ruin without sentiment. It happens, the land is not always kind. But you have stayed through it. We had more water, he said. And we had each other, my father and I, and later just me and the hands. He paused. It is easier to stay when you have someone staying with you. She heard the weight of the alone in that sentence. She thought about her own alone, which was a different kind, a Philadelphia kind, surrounded by people and still somehow hollow. Yes, she said. I think that is true. They sat on a flat-topped rock near the river and ate the lunch she had packed, simple bread and cheese and dried apricots, and drank from the canteen he had brought, and for a long time neither of them needed to speak. The river made its quiet sound and the mountains were large above them, and a squirrel scolded them from a juniper and then gave up. I kept the photograph, he said suddenly. She turned to look at him. What photograph? From the summer of 77. Someone took a photograph at one of those garden parties. A group of us standing on the lawn. He was looking at the river. You were standing 3 people to my left. You were wearing something blue, she remembered. She remembered every one of those afternoons with a clarity that 5 years had not dimmed. She had told herself it was only longing for youth, that general ache. She was no longer telling herself that. I remember, she said. I should have said something that summer, he said. I was 20 and I thought I had time, and then the move happened suddenly and the time was gone. He looked at her then, squarely, the way he looked at everything. I am not 20 anymore. No, she said softly, and I do not think time should be wasted again, he said. Her heart was very loud. What are you saying, Vernon? I am saying that I am very glad your aunt wrote to my mother's friend, and I am very glad that friend told Miss Clara where my family had settled, and I am very glad Miss Clara thought to have me collect you at the station. He paused. I am saying that whatever comes next, I do not want to be the man who fails to speak again. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had grown into himself in the open country, who had built something real with his hands and had learned to be honest. She thought about 5 years of pressing things flat. She thought about what her aunt had said about full lives and real ones. I am glad too, she said, and she meant all of it, every word and every implication. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the rock beside her. He held it lightly, just the warmth of it, and looked back at the river, and she thought she had never felt so precisely in the right place in all her life. They rode back in the long golden light of late afternoon, not hurrying, letting the horses find their own pace through the scrubland. He pointed things out to her as they rode, the name of a distant peak, a track in the red earth where deer had come down to water, the way the light caught the sage and made it silver. He was teaching her to see the country as he saw it. She realized, piece by piece, and she was learning it. Aunt Clara was on the porch when they returned, with her shawl and her sharp eyes, and she looked at them arriving together in the warm evening light and said, "There is stew on the stove," and said nothing else, but the satisfaction in her face said everything. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Hester had not expected to love as much as she did. Mornings with Clara, sitting in the kitchen with the windows open to catch the early cool, talking or reading aloud, or doing the quiet companionable things that 2 women who are not required to perform for each other can do. Afternoons managing the house, shopping at the general store in town, where she was beginning to be recognized and greeted by name, learning the particular community of Myra Wells, which was small and sometimes rough and genuinely human in ways that the social circles of Philadelphia were not. And Vernon in the evenings when he could ride the 3 miles from his ranch, and on Sundays when he stayed most of the day. They went riding regularly, and she was becoming a competent horsewoman, a fact that gave him visible pleasure and made her feel more confident in her skin than she had in years. They talked about everything, about his ranch and her embroidery, about books they had both read, about their families, about the country and what it was becoming. The territory in 1882 was changing. The railroad was threading its lines west, bringing settlers and goods and the particular complicated machinery of civilization, and the old ways were shifting. The cattle business was changing, with the big ranches pushing against the smaller ones. The Apache wars in the southern part of the territory were still a raw wound, things that she saw on people's faces when they were mentioned, a heaviness that came with years of conflict, an injustice that no one could fully untangle. Vernon spoke about it with the directness she expected from him now, acknowledging that the land the ranchers used had been someone else's land first, that what had been done to the peoples of the territory was not something that a man of conscience could look at straight and feel nothing. She respected that in him. She had grown up in the comfortable North where injustice was easy to look away from, and she was learning that the West did not let you look away as easily, because it was all happening here, in front of you, in the same dirt your boots were standing in. She met his ranch hands, 4 men who worked the cattle and the land and who looked at her with an evaluating curiosity that shifted to something warmer when she shook hands properly and remembered their names after the first introduction. There was a man named Alvaro, Mexican-born and third-generation rancher, who spoke about the land with a love that was older than the American settlement of it. There was a man named Doyle who was quiet and capable, and had been with the Ellsworth family since before the move west. There was a young man named Marcus who was 20 years old and enthusiastic about everything to the point of exhaustion, and a steadier older man named Pell who had been a cavalryman once and now wanted nothing more than to mend fences and tend cattle in peace. She liked them all. She liked the ranch, which was not elegant but was solidly built and well-maintained. The main house a low, sprawling structure of adobe and timber, with a wide porch facing west to catch the sunset, and a kitchen garden that Doyle kept with the same quiet diligence he applied to everything else. She liked the way Vernon moved in the space of his ranch, with an ease and authority that was not arrogance but simply the comfortable knowledge of a man who knows what he is doing in the place where he is doing it. She was falling in love with him. She knew this not as a sudden revelation but as the recognition of something that had been growing steadily all this time, in the conversation by the river and the rides through the foothills and the evenings on the porch. And if she was honest, since the very first moment she stepped off the train and saw him standing at the station post with his hat tipped down against the sun. Clara had a bad week in June. The coughing worsened, and she had 3 days of fever that frightened Hester more than she let herself show. And Dr. Paulson came twice and adjusted the medicines and told Hester to make sure she rested and drank broth. Vernon appeared the evening of the second bad day, having heard from someone in town that Miss Clara had taken a turn, and he brought food and stayed to help, quietly and without being asked, carrying in water and speaking gently to Clara, and giving Hester someone to lean against when she came outside for air after the long hours of nursing. She stood on the porch in the dark with him and put her forehead briefly against his shoulder, not as anything calculated, just because she needed something solid, and he stood very still and let her, his hand coming up to rest lightly on her back. "She is going to be all right for now," he said quietly. "She is strong." "I know," Hester said. Her voice was steady. She had decided to be steady about this, to accept what was coming without making it worse with her own grief, but standing in the dark with the coyotes calling somewhere distant, she let herself be not steady for just a moment. Then she straightened. "Thank you for coming." "I was always going to come," he said simply. She looked up at him in the dark, at his face that was all shadows and the warm edge of the lamplight from inside. She thought about 5 years. She thought about saying too little. "Vernon," she said. "Yes," he said very quietly. "I think you should know that I am not going back to Philadelphia." The night was very still. A moth bumped gently against the lamp glass inside. "What are you saying?" he asked, and his voice had gone careful the way it did when he was feeling something large. "I am saying that I have been thinking about it since I arrived, and I think that I belong here." She paused. "I think I have known it since the station, perhaps longer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Is that the only reason you are staying?" "No," she said, and her heart was loud. "It is not." He raised his hand and touched her face just briefly, his fingers against her cheek, a touch so careful and deliberate that it felt like something promised. "Good," he said softly. Then Clara called from inside, wanting water, and Hester went back in, and Vernon stayed another 2 hours and then rode home in the dark. And Hester lay on her cot that night with her hand against her cheek where he had touched her, and something warm and certain settled in her chest. Clara recovered from that bad week with the stubbornness of a woman who had decided she was not finished yet. She was thinner and slower, but her eyes were as bright as ever, and she took a sustained interest in Hester's life that was frankly intrusive and entirely welcome. "He is going to ask you," she told Hester one morning over coffee. Hester did not pretend not to know what she meant. "Perhaps. Not perhaps. I know a determined man when I see one. He has been building up to it." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Say yes, Hester." "You have no idea what he is planning to ask," Hester said. "I know what I would ask if I were him," Clara said, "and I know what I would want you to answer." Hester looked at her aunt's face, thinner now, the bones more present. She thought about what Clara had said early on about full lives and real ones. She thought about herself at 24 with a trunk and a sewing kit and a heart full of unspoken things, stepping off a train into the most extraordinary afternoon of her life. "You arranged this," she said slowly. "Didn't you? You knew he was here. You specifically asked the family to send me." Clara's expression was entirely serene. "I needed someone to come," she said, "and you needed somewhere to go." It seemed economical. "Aunt Clara," Hester said, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry or both, so she did both quietly for a moment, and then she reached across and took her aunt's hand and held it. "I know you," Clara said. "I always have, even from a distance. You are not a parlor woman, Hester. You are something bigger than that. This country will fit you." "It already does," Hester said honestly. A week later in July, when the heat was at its absolute peak, and the mountains shimmered blue above the heat haze, Vernon drove his wagon to Clara's house on a Thursday morning when he knew Hester went to the general store, and he met her there, which was not a coincidence, and neither of them pretended it was. He walked with her and helped her carry her parcels, and when they were back outside in the full sunlight standing beside his wagon, he took off his hat and held it in both hands and said, without preamble, because he was not a man who embellished, "I want to marry you, Hester." She looked at him. The street of Myra Wells moved around them, a wagon going past, someone calling to someone else across the way, the ordinary busy afternoon life of a small western town. She felt completely clear. "I am aware this is sudden by some standards," he said, carefully, "though I do not know that 5 years of thinking about it counts as sudden. I know you came here for your aunt and not for this, and I know you have a life in Philadelphia or the shape of one, but I am asking anyway." He held her gaze. "I have not said the things I should have said too many times. I do not intend to not say them again." "You are saying quite a lot right now," she said, and something in her smile softened the edges of it. He saw the smile and something in his face relaxed. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said. He put his hat back on, and then he smiled at her with his whole face, the kind of smile that had been making her warm since the garden parties of 1877, and he took her hand right there in the street of Myra Wells and held it, and she thought she had never in her life felt so precisely in the right moment at the right time. They told Clara that evening. She was sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, and they came and stood before her like two people presenting themselves for inspection, which was essentially what it was. Clara looked at them for a moment and then looked at the distant mountains and said, "Well, I did not do all of this for nothing, then." Vernon looked at Hester. Hester looked at Vernon, and then they both laughed, really laughed, warm and unguarded, and Clara rocked her chair and looked deeply pleased with herself and with the world. There were practical matters, of course, because there always are. Hester wrote to her mother. This was not a simple letter to compose. She sat with it for an evening and wrote it carefully and honestly, explaining not just the engagement but the reason, which was that this was where she belonged, which was something she had never known about herself in Philadelphia, because she had never been shown a world large enough to know what belonging felt like. She expected her mother to be upset. What she received back 2 weeks later was a letter that began with several lines of maternal worry and concluded with something that brought her to tears, a line that said, "You always seemed like you were waiting for something. I hope you have found it." She wrote also to her sister, who was characteristically direct, and asked exactly 3 questions in the order of priorities. Is he handsome? Is he kind? And will you be safe? Hester answered yes to all 3, and her sister wrote back with 4 pages of enthusiastic congratulations, and a detailed list of things she intended to send west in a crate at the earliest opportunity. The wedding was planned for September, when the worst of the heat would have broken, and when Clara would still be well enough to attend. This was not spoken aloud in those terms, but it was in all of them, the urgency of having her there, and so the plans were made accordingly. Myra Wells, it turned out, took a genuine community interest in the event. The women of the town, led by a forthright and energetic woman named Mrs. Holt, whose husband ran the general store, organized themselves with the efficiency of people who were accustomed to making things happen without the infrastructure that supported such things in larger cities. There would be a ceremony at the church with the white-painted steeple, and a reception on the wide main street afterward, which the town did for any wedding and for most large celebrations, because the street belonged to everyone. Hester found herself surrounded by women who knew the territory and knew Vernon, and who brought her into their circle with a directness that she found both slightly overwhelming and entirely genuine. Mrs. Holt was one. There was a woman named Ruby Oates whose husband had a competing general store a street over, and who got along with Mrs. Holt with the warm, adversarial energy of 2 women who respect each other too much to admit it openly. There was a young woman named Esperanza, Alvaro's sister, who worked as a seamstress and who immediately assessed Hester's measurements by eye with unnerving accuracy and announced that she would make the dress. The dress that Esperanza made was not elaborate by Philadelphia standards, but it was beautiful in a way that belonged to the country. Ivory cotton with fine embroidery along the cuffs and collar that Hester worked herself during the August evenings on Clara's porch. Esperanza gave her the practical piece of advice that a dress in this territory needed to be breathable and sturdy, and the result was something that Hester, when she first put it on for the fitting, looked at in the small mirror in Esperanza's workshop and thought, "Yes, this is what I should look like here." Clara sat up straighter when Hester came out in the dress for her to see. Her breathing was heavier these days, but her face was entirely lucid. "Thomas would have wanted to see this," she said, and her voice was even. "He was fond of the whole Keating family." "I know," Hester said gently. "I wish he could have." "He does somewhere," Clara said with the calm certainty of a woman who has had time to work out what she believes. "Come here." She took Hester's hand and held it for a moment, looking up at her. "Be happy," she said. "Not politely happy, really happy, the kind where you make noise about it sometimes." Hester laughed and felt her eyes sting. "I will try." "Vernon will make it easy," Clara said. "He is that kind of man." August was full and warm and busy, and somewhere inside all of it, Hester was aware of a quiet, extraordinary happiness that she kept touching carefully, the way you touch something fine to make sure it is real. She helped Vernon think through the future of the ranch, which was a genuine conversation and not a polite pretense, because she had quickly demonstrated that she was not a woman who wanted to be kept outside of practical decisions. He showed her the books, and she found 3 places where the costs could be trimmed, which he implemented without ego, and she realized that she admired him as much as she loved him, which seemed important. They had evenings on the ranch's west-facing porch watching the sunset, which was every bit as dramatic as the country deserved, the sky going orange and red, and a particular shade of violet that she could not have described to anyone in Philadelphia because the words for it did not exist in an Eastern vocabulary. She learned to cook on the ranch's larger wood stove, which was a different project from Clara's small kitchen, and she made mistakes and improved, and Doyle, who was the best cook among the hands, gave advice with the solemnity of a man passing on something sacred. She learned to handle a rifle. This was Vernon's suggestion and her own acceptance of it, because in the territory it was a practical skill and not a novelty, and she learned with the same focused attention she gave to everything, and within 3 weeks could hit a fence post at 50 yards reliably enough that Marcus declared her terrifying, and Pell nodded his measured approval. She wrote long letters to her mother and her sister describing all of it, and the letters that came back grew increasingly interested in the West and in this life she was making. Her sister wrote in late August to say she was thinking about visiting, which Hester knew was not an idle remark coming from her sister. 2 weeks before the wedding, something happened that shook the quiet of Myra Wells. A man rode in from the north, a rancher named Bellard who had the largest spread in the county, with 3 riders behind him, and he stopped at the Ellsworth ranch line and declared that he intended to run a road through the corner of Vernon's south pasture, and that Vernon would do well to agree to it without argument. Vernon, who had been in the south pasture at the time mending fence with Alvaro, came back with his hat pushed back on his head, and a particular expression that Hester had not seen on him before, a kind of deliberate stillness. He explained the situation to her that evening. Bellard was a large man in every sense. His cattle operation was 3 times the size of the Ellsworth ranch, and he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. What he wanted here was a road access that would cut 2 miles off his cattle drives to the rail line. It would be a significant encroachment on Vernon's land, and the implication in Bellard's delivery had not been subtle. "What will you do?" Hester asked. "Talk to the county land office," he said. "I have a deed. The south pasture is my land." "He has no right to it." He paused. "Bellard is used to smaller operators stepping aside. I do not intend to." She looked at him. "I did not think you would." "I wanted you to know about it," he said, "before the wedding, because it may not resolve quickly and it may be a difficulty for a while." "Vernon," she said, "I am here to stay. I did not come out here looking for easy." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "No," he said, "I know you didn't." He went to the land office in the county seat the next day and filed the proper paperwork asserting his legal claim to the south pasture and documenting Bellard's verbal trespass threat. The county surveyor, a methodical man who took his work seriously, came out within the week and confirmed the survey boundaries. Bellard received the formal notice. There was a confrontation at the edge of town, not violent but loud, with Bellard's riding foreman saying things in the saloon about whether Ellsworth would hold that property long, and Vernon hearing about it from Doyle and going to the saloon himself the next evening, and having a quiet word with Bellard's foreman that Hester heard about second-hand, and that apparently was quiet enough in tone and clear enough in content that the conversation did not continue. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him that I was going to marry a very smart woman who keeps records of everything," Vernon said, "and that I had filed all the appropriate legal documents, and that if Bellard wanted a legal dispute about a parcel of south pasture, he was welcome to have one." He paused. "I may have mentioned that she had also learned to shoot." Hester looked at him. "You did not." "I may have," he said with complete blandness. She laughed despite herself, and then she pointed out that this was perhaps not the most dignified legal strategy, and he agreed with such exaggerated solemnity that she laughed again. Bellard's interest in the south pasture did not disappear immediately, but it retreated into a simmering distance, which was satisfactory enough for the moment, and Vernon's survey deed was solid, and there were other ranchers in the county who had had their own difficulties with Bellard's expansion habits, and who made it quietly known that Ellsworth had their support. The territory was always a balance of these forces, the large and the small, the new arrivals and the established, and what mattered was being known as a man of your word with the documents to prove it. Clara sat on the front bench of the white-steepled church on the 14th of September, 1882, wrapped in her good shawl and her best composure, and watched her niece walk down the aisle of Myra Wells's only church with the bright morning light coming through the windows and the whole of the small town filling the pews. Hester was not wearing a veil. She had decided against it because she wanted to see everything clearly, all of it. The flowers Mrs. Holt had contributed from her garden, and the faces of the people of this community who had become, faster than she would have believed, her people. She wanted to see Vernon. He was standing at the front of the church in clean clothes and his good boots, his hat left behind for the occasion, and he was watching her come toward him with an expression so open and clear and unguarded that it made her throat tight. She walked toward him with steady steps, and she did not look away from his face. The Reverend was a young man named Marsh who had come to the territory 2 years ago with the same westward momentum that seemed to carry people here, and he spoke the words with a warmth that suited the occasion. Vernon's voice when he spoke his vows was steady and quiet and entirely serious, the voice of a man who chose his words carefully and meant everyone, and Hester's own voice was clearer than she had expected, because she was not afraid. When he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, and that she had said yes to without hesitation when he asked, she felt the weight of it as something solid and real and chosen. She looked up at him. "I do," she said, and it came out with the full weight of what she meant by it. He smiled at her. Then the Reverend pronounced them married, and Vernon kissed her with a quiet and complete tenderness that made someone in the back pews emit a small sound of satisfaction, which she suspected was Mrs. Holt. The reception on the main street was exactly what the West required of a celebration, which was to say it was loud and warm and involved considerable amounts of food, and a fiddle player who started in mid-afternoon and showed no signs of stopping. Hester danced with Vernon and then with Alvaro, who was formal and charming about it, and then with Marcus, who was enthusiastic to the point of nearly stepping on her feet twice, and then with Doyle, who danced with the careful precision of a man who learned the steps as a practical skill and applied them accordingly. Clara sat at a table with Mrs. Holt and watched all of it with the bright-eyed pleasure of a woman who has done something she can be satisfied about. In the evening, when the celebration was winding down and the lanterns were lit along the street and the fiddle had finally stopped for the player's sake, Hester sat beside Clara at the table while Vernon was talking with some of the neighboring ranchers a little way off. Clara's energy was spent, she could see it, but her face was peaceful. "Are you happy?" Clara asked. "Yes," Hester said with no qualification. Clara nodded. She looked at Vernon across the street, at the way he stood, relaxed and present in his own place, and then at Hester. "Good," she said. "That is enough for me." She rested her head against Hester's shoulder just briefly, and Hester put her arm around her gently, and they sat in the warm September evening while the town celebrated around them, and Hester breathed the sage and the dust and the faint sweet smoke of the lanterns, and she thought, "This is my life. This is the real one." Clara declined slowly through October and November, not dramatically but steadily, the way the light changed as the year turned, a little less each day. Hester sat with her every morning and most evenings, and Vernon came often, and the women of Myra Wells came in rotation, because that was how communities in the territory worked. You showed up for each other, and Clara had been part of this place for 2 decades, and the place knew it. Clara talked more as she weakened, which Hester thought was its own kind of grace, all those stories that had nowhere to go except into the listening of someone who would carry them. She talked about her husband Thomas and the life they built together, about the droughts and the good years, about the friends who had come and gone and some who had died, about the territory changing around her. She talked about her family in Philadelphia with a warm distance, the way you talk about a country you once lived in, familiar but not home. One evening in November she said to Hester, "I want you to have my garden." Hester looked up from her embroidery. "The house is yours to leave where you wish." "The house I am leaving to the church for a schoolroom," Clara said. "They need one, but the garden is a separate thing. I put 20 years into that garden." She paused. "Take what you can to the ranch. The roses, the lavender, they are hardy enough to transplant." "I will," Hester said. "I promise. And the embroidery box, your grandmother's. I borrowed it from your mother in 1859 and I have never returned it." She smiled faintly. "Your mother pretended she didn't remember me taking it." "I will return it to her," Hester said. Her voice was very steady. "Or keep it," Clara said. "You are better with it than she ever was." Clara died on the 23rd of November in her own bed, with Hester holding her hand, and it was as quiet and clear as everything about her had been. Dr. Paulson came and confirmed what they knew, and Vernon came an hour later and held Hester while she let herself grieve properly, not quietly or politely, but fully and without apology, and he did not try to rush her through it or repair it, just held her and let it be what it was. The whole of Myra Wells came to the funeral, and the Reverend spoke about her 20 years in the territory and the kind of woman who made a place better simply by being in it, which was true. They buried her next to Thomas, in the small cemetery east of town, where the mountains stood large on the horizon, and Hester put lavender on the grave because Clara had loved it. Hester transplanted the garden roses to the ranch house in December, when the temperature had cooled enough to make it possible, and Doyle helped her with a quiet competence that she was grateful for. They went into the ground at the east side of the ranch house, and she watered them carefully and covered their roots with mulch, and in the spring they bloomed, which felt like something that deserved to be acknowledged. Winter on the ranch was its own education. The cold was different from Philadelphia cold, drier and cleaner, and the silence of the territory in winter was enormous and beautiful. She spent the long evenings with Vernon, reading by the fire or talking, or playing cards with Doyle and Pell, who came in from the bunkhouse on the coldest evenings for warmth and company. She learned the rhythms of the cattle through the cold months, the feeding and checking, the particular concern about the northern pasture where the wind came in without breaks, and she went out with Vernon for many of the morning rounds, because she had made a decision to know this ranch as well as he did, which was a decision he had immediately supported with every practical tool at his disposal. She wrote to her mother every 2 weeks and received letters back that were becoming, slowly and wonderfully, the letters of 2 women rather than a mother and a daughter performing their roles. Her mother wrote about the household and about her garden and about Hester's father, who was well but who was growing more set in his chairs and his routines. And she wrote, tentatively at first and then more openly, about her own life, things she had not said to Hester in the efficient business of raising a family, and Hester read these letters carefully and wrote back in kind. Her sister came in March. This was not a surprise, because her sister had written 3 separate letters about planning to come, and had then simply appeared on the train with her own trunk and a hat slightly too fashionable for the Myra Wells platform. And Hester met her at the station and stood at the same spot where Vernon had first met her and laughed at the full circle of it. Her sister, whose name was Frances and who had the Keating sharpness of eye in fuller measure than any of them, took in Myra Wells with wide and interested attention, and then took in Vernon with the same attention, and then took Hester by the arm and said, "All right, I understand everything now," which was the most efficient assessment Hester had ever heard. Frances stayed 3 weeks and made herself completely at home, which was entirely her nature. And by the end of the first week Doyle was making special pie on the evenings she was there, which no one commented on but which everyone noticed. Vernon said nothing about this except once, quietly, to Hester when he said, "Your sister is something," and Hester agreed that she entirely was. Frances went back to Philadelphia at the end of March with the seeds of the territory in her traveling bag, figuratively and nearly literally, and she wrote from the train that she intended to return, and the way she said it made Hester think she meant it in a larger sense than just visiting. By spring it was fully and completely clear that Bellard had not entirely given up his interest in Ellsworth land, though he had shifted his approach. Rather than direct confrontation, he had moved to legal maneuvering, filing a complaint with the county about a water access question on the northern boundary that was tenuously argued at best. Vernon engaged a lawyer from Albuquerque, a man named Sawyer who was known in land law, and Hester helped prepare all the documentation with the thoroughness that Clara had said she was capable of, and the case was argued before the county assessor in April, and resolved in Vernon's favor with enough clarity that Bellard received a pointed note from the assessor's office about filing frivolous complaints. At the hearing, Hester had sat in the public seats and watched Vernon present their case with the same quiet directness he brought to everything, and afterward Sawyer had told her that her organization of the supporting documents had made the difference in the room. She had thanked him and then gone and stood in the April sunshine outside the county building, and felt the particular satisfaction of work done well. "You enjoyed that," Vernon said, coming to stand beside her, his hat in his hands again. "Tremendously," she said honestly. He looked at her with warmth and a kind of wondering quality. "I think you may be more capable than I am in half a dozen areas." "At least half a dozen," she agreed pleasantly. He laughed, and it was the comfortable large laugh of a man entirely secure in himself, and she thought she would never stop being glad of that quality in him. Spring turned towards summer, and Hester realized in May that she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for a quiet morning before she told Vernon, not because she needed time to be sure, but because she wanted a moment of just herself and the extraordinary fact of it. She told him that evening on the west porch in the last of the daylight, and his face went through something that she watched carefully and loved completely, a kind of still amazement, and then a joy that was not performed or managed but just entirely present, breaking open on his face like the territory breaking open under rain. He took both her hands. He held them. He did not say anything for a moment, and when he did his voice was rough with feeling. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am wonderful, actually." He kissed her then, with the full warmth of everything he was and everything they were, and then he put his forehead against hers and she felt him breathe. "We are going to need a bigger kitchen garden," he said eventually, in a tone of great practicality, and she laughed and he laughed with her, and the evening settled around them full of the particular gold light that the territory produced when it was being beautiful, which was often. She wrote to her mother, who wrote back such a long and overflowing letter that Hester had to read it in 2 sittings. She wrote to Frances, who immediately began planning another visit, and who this time mentioned that she might be bringing a friend, the details of which were intriguing in ways that Hester noted but did not probe. The summer of 1883 was full, in the way that good summers are, not without difficulty, because the territory did not give difficulty-free seasons. There was a drought concern in July that kept Vernon watchful through the whole month, and there was a complicated situation with a neighboring family's cattle crossing the south fence that required patience and diplomacy to resolve, and Hester was 6 months along, and learning new relationships with heat and discomfort that she managed with as much grace as she could. But full. The ranch was full, and the days were full, and the community of Myra Wells moved around her and Vernon with the easy belonging of people who had become part of a place. Esperanza made her several dresses that accommodated the pregnancy with the same practical grace she brought to everything she made, and Ruby Oates at the general store held back a shipment of a particular good hand soap that she knew Hester liked and called it setting things aside for the duration, which was the kind of specific kindness that Hester had come to understand was the vocabulary of this community. Her son was born in October of 1883, in the early morning with Dr. Paulson present and Esperanza as well, who had declared her assistance in the matter as inevitable some weeks earlier. He was large and healthy and vocal about his opinions from the first moment, which Hester recognized as a Keating family trait, and which made Vernon, when they put the baby in his arms, look down at his son with an expression so private and so full that she felt she was witnessing something she would never forget. They named him Thomas Ellsworth, for Clara's husband and for the ranch's landscape of kindness, and Thomas was the name that Clara would have recognized and been moved by. Hester wrote the letter to her mother with Thomas in one arm and the pen in the other hand, and her mother's response arrived 3 weeks later, and was, among many other things, a direct and sincere statement that she intended to come and see for herself, which she did in the spring of 1884, arriving on the same rail line that Hester had taken 2 years before, looking smaller against the western sky than she did in Philadelphia, but no less herself. And when she held Thomas, she cried without apologizing for it, which was the most honest Hester had ever seen her mother. Her mother stayed 6 weeks. It was a complicated and layered 6 weeks in the way that any two people reconciling themselves to a changed relationship must have. But Vernon was steady and welcoming, and made her mother feel that the ranch was a good place for her daughter, which was the thing her mother most needed to know. And Myra Wells was kinder to her mother than she had expected, and her mother left at the end of 6 weeks with dusty boots and seeds from Clara's transplanted garden in her bag, and something lighter in her face than she had carried west. Frances came that same summer, this time with her friend, a woman named Helen who turned out to be a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had been reading about the West with increasing appetite, and who accepted an offer, facilitated by Hester and Vernon, and essentially everyone in Myra Wells who could put a word in, to take on the teaching position at the school that was now operating in Clara's donated adobe house. Helen was practical and confident, and found the territory to her taste immediately, which Hester watched with great satisfaction. Frances herself stayed longer than Helen. She stayed through August and into September, and she spent a significant portion of her time at the ranch, and Doyle made pie regularly, and by September the situation had clarified itself to the point where Vernon took Hester aside one morning and said, "Do you know what is happening with your sister and Doyle?" And Hester said, "Yes," and Vernon said, "Should I say something?" And Hester said, "Absolutely not, let them find their own way." And Vernon thought about it and then nodded and stayed out of it, which was the right decision. Frances went back to Philadelphia in October, but she wrote to Hester with a frequency that had not previously characterized their correspondence, and the letters were specific and detailed in ways that confirmed what everyone already knew. She returned the following spring, and the spring after that, and eventually Frances Keating arrived in Myra Wells in the spring of 1886, not with a trunk but with several trunks, having accepted a position as a bookkeeper for 2 of the local businesses, having managed this from Philadelphia through a correspondence that Hester had quietly facilitated, and Doyle met her at the station. Hester stood on the porch of the ranch house on the evening of Frances's arrival and watched the 2 of them come up the road in Doyle's wagon, and she felt something round and complete in her chest, the shape of things working out the way they should. Vernon came to stand behind her, Thomas on his hip, almost 3 years old now and opinionated about everything, and Vernon's hand settled warm on her shoulder. "You're doing," he said. "Partly," she said. "They did the rest themselves." "As they should," he said. By 1886, the Ellsworth Ranch was in the best shape it had ever been. The drought fears of the previous years had resolved into 2 good wet seasons that made the south pasture green in ways that made Vernon walk out there on mornings just to look at it. The cattle were healthy and numerous. The contracts with the rail line were reliable, and the legal situation with Bellard had resolved itself through the natural consequence of Bellard overextending his own operations and selling off a significant portion of his holdings to a land company, after which his remaining management paid much less attention to the borders of neighboring ranches. Vernon had bought a small additional parcel to the northwest, adding to the ranch's water access in a way that gave them security through the dry seasons. The house had grown too, not dramatically but in the useful way that a living place grows. There was a second bedroom, built by Vernon and Alvaro and Marcus over the course of one industrious autumn, for Thomas and for whoever might come next, and there was a larger covered porch where Hester kept her embroidery and her books and the rocking chair that had been Clara's, and that she had brought from the adobe house before it became the schoolroom. The schoolroom was a source of particular satisfaction. She had been on the school board since 1884, one of the first women asked to serve in that capacity in the territory, and she took the work seriously and brought to it the same organizational attention she brought to the ranch's books and the land office documentation. Helen was a good teacher, and the school had grown from a handful of students to nearly 20, and Hester thought sometimes about Clara saying she was not a parlor woman, and thought that this was what she had meant. She had her own embroidery work as well, which had moved beyond the small commissions of her Philadelphia years into something larger. She took orders from the town and from 3 stores in Albuquerque, and the work was known for its particular quality. She had taught Esperanza some of the Eastern techniques and learned in return the Southwestern patterns that came from the older traditions of the territory, and what she made now was a blend that was entirely its own thing and belonged to no single place, which she thought was appropriate. On a Wednesday evening in September of 1886, she sat on the wide porch in Clara's rocking chair, while Vernon read near the lamp and Thomas played on the porch floor with the collection of small carved wooden animals that Alvaro made for him. And the mountains were purple against the evening sky, and the roses she had planted from Clara's garden had gone late into the season, and one of them was still blooming, a deep dark red against the adobe wall. She thought about the train station 2 years and something ago, and the moment she had stepped off the car and seen him, this man now reading quietly near her, one leg crossed over the other, and his hat on the peg by the door where it always was. She had thought about it many times, the extraordinary pivoting of that moment, the whole shape of the life she had not known she was about to enter. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, without looking up from his book. "The station," she said. "When I first arrived." He looked up then. "What about it?" "I keep thinking about how easily it might not have happened," she said. "If Clara had written to anyone else in the family, if you had not been there that day." He set the book down. "I would have been there," he said. "I had been asking after the Keating family for 2 years before Clara wrote." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I wrote to my mother's friend here in Myra Wells," he said simply. "Twice, asking after your family. She knew your aunt. I was trying to find a way to make a connection that would not seem like writing to you directly without invitation." He paused. "I did not know if you would welcome it." She stared at him. "You were already looking." "For a while," he said. The evening sat around them, the September air beginning to cool, the mountains going to darker colors, Thomas murmuring to his wooden horses in the way of children who are entirely absorbed in their own world. She looked at this man she had married, who had been 20 years old and standing 3 people to her left at a garden party in 1877, who had looked at her across the punch bowl with something she had filed away and never stopped holding. "Vernon," she said. "Yes," he said, in that same careful way of a man about to feel something large. "I love you," she said, entirely and without any qualification. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had been learning for years and had not yet finished, that particular quality of his that was like sunlight on the river, warm and moving and entirely real. Then he got up from his chair and came and crouched beside hers and took her hand. "I know," he said. I have always known. That is the best thing I know." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth briefly, warmly against it. "And I love you, Hester Ellsworth, entirely and without any qualification." Thomas from the floor said firmly, "No horses talking," which was apparently a ruling about the noise level of their conversation, and they both looked at their son and then at each other, and the evening broke open into laughter. In the spring of 1887, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara, because there was no other name that would have done. She arrived in March when the territory was still cool, and the roses were beginning to put out new growth, and she was quieter than Thomas had been but no less present, with a way of looking at things with focused intensity that Hester recognized from the mirror. Thomas was 3.5 and took the whole business of a sister with the philosophical resignation of a child who has been given a long explanation of something and is not entirely convinced, but is willing to wait and see. He sat beside her in Vernon's arms the first morning and looked at her carefully, and then announced that she had too much hair, which was inaccurate but delivered with great confidence. Clara looked up at him with her wide, focused eyes, and Thomas, over the course of the following weeks, became her devoted defender and explainer of all things, which lasted for their entire childhoods. Hester recovered well, because she was strong, and because Vernon was attentive in ways that were practical and warm without being hovering, which was the exactly right balance. And by April she was back on the porch in the rocking chair with little Clara in the crook of one arm and her embroidery in the other hand. She thought about her aunt often. She thought about the letter arriving on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, about being the Keating girl with the fewest reasons to stay, about the way the universe had arranged things with a particular efficiency that she found difficult not to interpret as intentional. Clara had been a woman who believed in the direct approach. She had looked at her niece who was living half a life in the parlors of Philadelphia, and at the young man 3 miles to her east who was asking around for news of a Keating girl and had written a letter. She had brought them to the same station platform in the blazing afternoon of New Mexico territory, and the rest had been theirs to make. She looked up from her embroidery at the ranch spread before her, the horses moving in the near pasture, the mountains standing permanent and blue against the May sky, Vernon's figure coming across the yard from the barn with a purposeful, unhurried stride, already looking toward the porch for her, and she thought, "Full," Clara had said, "a full life. This is what she meant." He came up to the porch and sat on the step near her close and leaned his back against the post and looked at the pasture and the mountains, and little Clara was asleep in the crook of Hester's arm, and Thomas could be heard somewhere around the side of the house conducting a conversation with himself in the absorbed tones of a child entirely engaged in some private project. "Good morning," she asked. "Good fence," he said, which meant the morning's work had been satisfying. "The new north section will hold through the winter. Marcus's work, mostly Alvaro's. Marcus held the posts," he smiled. "He held them well." She laughed softly, not to wake the baby. The morning was warm, and the sage was just beginning to come back into full growth, and the distant hawk was drawing its long, slow circle. She had her husband beside her and her children near her and her own work in her hands and her community around her, and this landscape that had reached in and rearranged the geography of her heart since the first afternoon. She thought about writing a letter to Frances, who was now living in Myra Wells and was Mrs. Frances Doyle, and was expecting her own first child in the autumn, and was characteristically direct about the whole business, having announced it to Hester with the same efficiency with which she announced everything. She thought about writing to her mother, who was talking about coming west again in the fall, and about whom she had the growing feeling that Philadelphia was slowly becoming a former address. She thought about Helen, still teaching in Clara's schoolroom, and about Esperanza fitting the spring order of dresses that 3 different women in the territory had commissioned, and about Mrs. Holt, who had flagged her down in the general store, last Tuesday to discuss the school board question about the new textbooks with the authoritative energy of a woman who had opinions about everything and was always worth listening to. She thought about the small grave east of town, with the lavender growing over it now, and Thomas and Clara's names carved together on the stone. She thought about what Clara had told her about full lives and real ones, about not being a parlor woman, about saying yes. Vernon said, "What are you thinking about?" without looking away from the mountains, because he knew her thinking face now and had learned not to interrupt it, just to ask when it seemed to have resolved to something. "That you were right," she said. He looked at her. "About that a week is enough for some people," she said, "that the territory gets into you if you let it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did it take a week?" She thought about the platform, the blazing afternoon, the precise moment his eyes had found hers through the crowd, the thing that had opened in her chest like a window after years of closed rooms. "Less," she said. He smiled, looking back at the mountains. "Same," he said. Little Clara made a small sound in her sleep, and Hester shifted her gently, and the morning moved forward in the way that mornings do when everything that needs to be settled has been settled, and everything that needs to begin has already begun, warmly and fully, and without any reservation. She picked up her embroidery again. The pattern she was working was something new, something she had designed herself in the long evenings of the past winter, mountain shapes and the particular curve of the river through the foothills, and the roses that bloomed against the adobe wall in September. She was making it for no commission, for no sale, for nothing except the pleasure of making the landscape with her own hands, thread by thread, this place that was hers. Vernon reached over without looking and rested his hand briefly on her knee. Just a touch, the particular warmth of someone who knows you and is glad to be near you, and she put her free hand over his for a moment before going back to the work. The horses moved in the pasture. Thomas came around the corner of the house and announced that he had found a very large beetle, and that it was interesting, and that he intended to show it to Alvaro. Vernon said, "Go ahead and be careful of the fence," and Thomas went at a run in the direction of the barn, with the confidence of a child, entirely at home in a big world. The mountains stood where they had always stood, permanent and patient, and the territory stretched out in every direction, full of its own life, its own history, its own complicated beauty, and the ranch sat in the middle of it, solid and well-rooted as the cottonwood tree at Clara's house, the one that still stood because Clara had watered it in dry years and the territory had kept it in the wet ones. Hester Ellsworth, who had been Hester Keating on a platform in the blazing afternoon of May 1882, sat in her rocking chair on her porch and watched her daughter sleep and watched her husband look at the mountains and let the morning be exactly what it was, which was full and real and entirely hers. The roses against the adobe bloomed deep red through October that year, later than they ever had before, as if they had decided one season was not enough. And when the first frost finally came and they went to sleep for the winter, Hester looked at them from the porch in the early gray morning and thought of Clara with a warmth that had nothing of grief in it anymore, only gratitude, and the quiet kept certainty that the letter arriving on a Tuesday had been the beginning of the rest of her life, and that the rest of her life had turned out to be the very best kind.